My daughter-in-law filed a lawsuit against me, attempting to seize my husband's inheritance. That manipulative woman has been abusing everyone around her, and her Alzheimer's symptoms are beginning to show. We had to protect what was rightfully ours. When the judge reviewed her case, he looked directly at her and declared, "Ma'am, she is one of the most respected judges in this city, and I'm honored to have her in my courtroom today." Follow my story to the very end, and please comment with the city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story reaches across the world. My name is Charlotte Brooks. I'm 60 years old, and for the past 25 years, I've served as a judge at the Miami-Dade County Superior Court. Throughout my career, I believed I'd witnessed every conceivable form of betrayal within the four walls of my courtroom. Never in my darkest nightmares did I imagine that the most devastating betrayal would come from within my own family. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I had just returned from my routine morning walk, still wearing my exercise clothes and feeling the pleasant burn of exertion in my muscles, when I discovered the thick envelope wedged into my mailbox. It bore the official seal of the civil court, a seal I'd seen thousands of times in my professional capacity. For a brief moment, I assumed it contained documents related to one of my cases. Then I saw my name listed not as the presiding judge, but as the defendant. My hands trembled slightly as I read the caption aloud to my empty entryway, "Charlotte Brooks versus Sarah Mendoza Brooks." Sarah, my daughter-in-law. The woman I'd welcomed into our family with open arms. The woman I'd come to think of as the daughter I'd never had. I sank into one of my kitchen chairs, watching my morning coffee grow cold and forgotten as I forced myself to read through every devastating line. Sarah was alleging that I suffered from severe cognitive decline, that I'd become abusive toward family members, and that I posed a danger to myself and others. She was petitioning the court to declare me mentally incompetent and to appoint herself and my son David as my legal guardians, with full control over my assets, my healthcare decisions, and essentially my entire life. The words seemed to blur and swim before my eyes. Mentally incompetent, family abuser, danger to society. Each accusation landed like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. How was this possible? This was the same woman I'd embraced with genuine joy when David first introduced her 8 years ago. The same woman who had sobbed on my shoulder during their marital difficulties, seeking my counsel and comfort. The same woman I'd trusted implicitly with my son's happiness. And now she was attempting to destroy everything I'd built over 6 decades of life? The shrill ring of my telephone shattered my spiraling thoughts. It was Linda, my judicial assistant of 15 years. "Charlotte, are you all right?" she asked the moment I walked into my office an hour later, her experienced eyes taking in what must have been my haggard appearance. "You look absolutely terrible." I hesitated, my hand hovering over my briefcase. 4 years, my entire career really, I'd maintained strict boundaries between my personal and professional lives. But this situation was different. This wasn't just personal drama. If Sarah succeeded with her lawsuit, my 25-year career as a respected judge would be irreparably damaged. The whispers would follow me forever. "Linda," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to review something for me. But this has to remain strictly confidential. Between us only." I watched her expressive face transform as she read through the documents, her eyes widening first in disbelief, then narrowing with indignation and barely contained fury. "Your daughter-in-law is doing this?" Her voice rose with each word. "The same one who's constantly coming here asking for favors and using your position for her own benefit?" She was absolutely right. Over the past few years, Sarah had visited my office dozens of times. She always needed something: reference letters for jobs she inevitably quit within months, glowing recommendations for apartments she couldn't actually afford, introductions to my professional contacts for business opportunities that invariably collapsed. And I, like a fool blinded by love and trust, had always said yes. Always helped. Always enabled. I remembered her last visit with painful clarity. It had been only 3 weeks ago. She'd arrived at my office in tears, mascara running down her carefully made-up face, claiming that she and David were facing financial catastrophe. According to her tearful account, David's construction business was failing, and they were on the verge of losing their house. "Charlotte, you're the only one who can help us," she'd said, clutching my hands in hers with desperate intensity. "We just need a small loan to tide us over until things improve. Just enough to get us through this rough patch." I'd given her $20,000 from my retirement savings, money I'd been carefully setting aside for years, sacrificing small luxuries and comforts to build a secure future. I'd done it because I loved her, because I trusted her completely, because I believed that's what family members do for each other. They help without hesitation or reservation. Looking back now, with the brutal clarity of hindsight, I could see how calculated that conversation had been. Sarah had asked very specific questions about my finances during that visit, my investment portfolio, my real estate holdings, even the details of my will. At the time, I'd interpreted her questions as genuine concern for my well-being, the natural curiosity of a loving daughter-in-law who cared about my future security. How incredibly naive I'd been. Linda's voice yanked me back to the present moment. "Charlotte, this is extremely serious. Even if she loses this lawsuit, which she absolutely should, the mere existence of these allegations could permanently damage your reputation. You know how the legal community operates." She was absolutely right. In our world, even completely baseless accusations could tarnish a career built over decades. Rumors spread with wildfire speed through courthouse corridors, and trust, once shattered, becomes nearly impossible to rebuild. The damage might be irreparable regardless of the outcome. That evening, when I finally pulled into my driveway, emotionally and physically exhausted, I found David waiting for me. My 35-year-old son stood beside his truck, looking profoundly uncomfortable, his eyes fixed firmly on the ground as he nervously jangled his car keys. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice tight with tension. "About the lawsuit your wife filed against me?" I responded directly, too drained for diplomatic niceties or careful phrasing. David visibly flinched. "You already know about it." "Of course I know about it, David." My exhaustion made my voice sharp. "Did you seriously believe you could do something like this behind my back and I wouldn't find out immediately?" My son released a long, heavy sigh, and for the first time in years, I glimpsed the frightened little boy who used to run into my arms seeking comfort from his nightmares. "Mom, Sarah is genuinely worried about you. You've been different lately. Not quite yourself." "Different how, exactly?" I challenged him. "More forgetful. Sometimes you tell the same stories multiple times in a single conversation. Last month you completely forgot my birthday, something you've never done before in my entire life." I froze, ice forming in my veins. It was true that I'd forgotten his birthday, but that was because I'd been consumed by an particularly complex and demanding case. As for repeating stories, didn't everyone do that occasionally as they aged? It was a normal part of human behavior, not evidence of mental decline. "David, I forget things occasionally just like any 60-year-old person. That doesn't mean I'm losing my mind or becoming incompetent." "Sarah also says you've been aggressive, that you screamed at her during her last visit here." I remembered that particular incident with perfect clarity. Sarah had arrived at my home unannounced, as she always did, and had begun rearranging my kitchen cabinets without asking permission, as if my home were her own to reorganize at will. When I'd politely asked her to stop, she'd accused me of being unreasonably stubborn and impossible to please. Yes, I'd raised my voice in frustration, but who wouldn't be annoyed by such presumptuous behavior in their own home? "Your wife is deliberately manipulating the truth, David. And apparently, she's manipulating you as well." But even as I spoke these words with conviction, a small seed of doubt began germinating in my mind, sending tiny roots of uncertainty through my certainty. What if they were right? What if I truly was losing my mental faculties and I was simply the last person to recognize it? What if my perception of reality was already compromised? David left that night without resolving anything, and I was left alone with my thoughts, my fears, and my growing self-doubt. For the first time in decades, perhaps in my entire adult life, I felt truly vulnerable and unprotected. Sarah had accomplished something that no criminal I'd faced across my courtroom had ever managed. She'd made me doubt my own mind, my own judgment, my own reality. But as I lay awake that endless night, staring at the ceiling shadows, something stronger than fear began crystallizing within me. It was the same fierce determination that had driven me to become one of the most respected judges in the county, despite all the obstacles I'd faced as a woman in a male-dominated field. If Sarah wanted a legal battle, she would certainly get one. But she had no idea who she was really dealing with. She'd gravely underestimated her opponent. I couldn't sleep that entire night. Instead, I sat in my living room, surrounded by photo albums I hadn't opened in years, trying desperately to understand how I'd arrived at this nightmare scenario. The photographs transported me back 8 years, to that first dinner when David brought Sarah home to meet me. I remembered being genuinely excited, almost giddy with anticipation. David had dated several women seriously over the years, but he'd never brought anyone home to meet his mother. This felt different. This felt significant. Sarah had arrived wearing an elegant navy blue dress, her hair styled perfectly, and wearing a smile that seemed to illuminate my entire dining room. From the moment she crossed my threshold, she exuded warmth and charm. "Mrs. Brooks, David has told me so much about you," she'd said, embracing me as if we'd known each other for years rather than seconds. "It's such an honor to meet the most respected judge in all of Miami." From that very first moment, Sarah had possessed an uncanny ability to make me feel special, valued, and seen. She asked insightful questions about my cases, showed genuine interest in my career, and constantly sought my advice on every imaginable topic. During that first dinner, she praised my cooking so effusively that I'd insisted on sending her home with copies of my grandmother's cherished recipes. When they left that night, I was absolutely convinced that David had found his perfect match. "I really like her," I'd told David on the phone the next day, still glowing from the successful evening. "You can tell she genuinely loves you and values family above everything." How catastrophically wrong I'd been. Over the following months, Sarah became an increasingly constant presence in my life. She appeared at my house unannounced regularly, always armed with some plausible excuse. She'd been in the neighborhood and thought she'd drop by, she needed a specific recipe, she wanted my opinion on something important. Initially, I'd loved the attention and companionship. After years of living alone following my husband's death, having someone who seemed to genuinely care about me felt wonderful and healing. "Charlotte, have you eaten anything today?" she'd ask with apparent concern, inspecting the contents of my refrigerator with a critical eye. "You really need to take better care of yourself. David and I worry about you constantly." Looking back now, I could see that there was always a subtle criticism wrapped carefully in seemingly genuine concern. My dishes weren't clean enough. My house was too cluttered and messy. My clothes were outdated and unfashionable. But she delivered these criticisms with such apparent sweetness and concern that I'd felt nothing but gratitude for having someone who paid such close attention to these details of my life. 6 months after that first meeting, David announced they were getting married. Sarah had cried tears of apparent joy when she asked me to stand in as her mother figure at the wedding. "My mom passed away when I was very young," she'd explained through her tears, her voice breaking convincingly. "I've always dreamed of having a mother figure present at my wedding. Would you do me the incredible honor of filling that role?" Of course I'd said yes immediately. Not only that, I'd insisted on paying for the majority of the wedding expenses. David was my only child, and Sarah claimed to have no family members who could afford to contribute to a proper celebration. I'd spent $40,000 of my carefully accumulated savings on that wedding. At the time, watching them exchange vows and seeing their happiness, I believed every penny was worth it. How wrong I'd been. With the clarity of hindsight, I could now identify all the warning signs I'd ignored or rationalized away. During the wedding preparations, Sarah had made every single decision without consulting me, despite the fact that I was financing the entire affair. Whenever I'd ventured to suggest something, a different color scheme, an alternative venue, a more modest approach, she'd responded with a condescending smile and a pat on my hand. "Charlotte, you're so wonderfully traditional," she'd say in a tone that made traditional sound like a character flaw. "Trust me on this. I understand what's current and stylish. You'll love the final result." After the wedding, her visits became even more frequent and increasingly invasive. I'd given Sarah a key to my house, intended strictly for emergencies, and she'd begun using it freely, letting herself in whenever she pleased. I'd come home from work to find she'd been there in my absence, rearranging my belongings according to her own preferences. "I'm just trying to help you," she'd say whenever I gently confronted her about these intrusions. "This house is far too large for you to manage alone at your age. David and I have been discussing it, and we really think you should consider downsizing to something more manageable. Something smaller that wouldn't be such a burden." She had gradually begun interfering with my financial decisions as well. When I'd mentioned considering a kitchen renovation, she'd persuasively argued it wasn't worth the investment at my age. When I discussed selling some stocks to diversify my investment portfolio, she'd warned me that the market was too volatile and I should wait for more stability. "You're obviously very intelligent, Charlotte," she'd say with that same condescending pat on my hand, "but modern financial markets are incredibly complicated and nuanced. You really should let David and me help you navigate these complex decisions. We have your best interests at heart." The couple's financial troubles had begun in earnest during their second year of marriage. First, it was David's construction business, which supposedly needed seed capital to expand. I'd loaned them $50,000 without hesitation. Then Sarah had lost her job at a real estate agency, and they'd needed help covering their mortgage payments for 6 months. After that, Sarah's car had broken down irreparably, and she'd needed a new vehicle to search for employment effectively. Each loan had been accompanied by tears, heartfelt hugs, and solemn promises of repayment that never, ever materialized. And I'd kept giving, kept enabling, because I truly believed that's what families do. They support each other through difficult times without keeping score. "You're so incredibly generous, Charlotte," Sarah would say after each loan, her eyes brimming with apparently genuine gratitude. "David and I are so fortunate to have you in our lives. We'll pay you back as soon as our business takes off. We promise." But the business never took off. There was always a new crisis, a new emergency, a new catastrophe that required my immediate financial intervention. Over the course of 5 years, I'd loaned them more than $200,000. Money I never saw again and probably never would. There had been more subtle changes too, ones I'd barely noticed at the time. Sarah had begun questioning my decisions more directly and more publicly. When I'd forgotten to bring a gift to a neighbor's baby shower, she'd said loudly enough for others to hear, "Charlotte, how could you be so thoughtless and inconsiderate? Poor Maria was counting on you to bring something special." When I'd arrived late to a family dinner because I'd been detained by a particularly complicated case at work, Sarah had sighed dramatically for everyone's benefit. "Charlotte, you're not getting any younger. Perhaps it's time to seriously consider retirement before the demands of work begin affecting you more seriously." Each comment had been like a single drop of poison, so small and diluted that it was barely noticeable in isolation, but cumulative and toxic in their combined effect. Gradually, imperceptibly, I'd begun doubting myself, questioning decisions I'd once made with complete confidence and certainty. The most insidious manipulation had occurred over the past 2 years. Sarah had started making pointed comments about my mental health in front of other family members and friends, planting seeds of doubt in their minds. "Charlotte's been a bit confused lately," she confided to David when she thought I was out of earshot, but always ensuring I could just barely hear. Yesterday she told me the exact same story 3 times in a row. We're becoming genuinely worried about her cognitive state. During family gatherings, she'd pull my sister aside for whispered conversations. "Sometimes Charlotte forgets really important things. Just the other day, she left the stove on all night. The house could have burned down. That incident had never actually happened. But when my sister had asked me about it later, expressing her concern, Sarah's seed of doubt had already taken root. "Are you absolutely certain it didn't happen, Charlotte?" my sister had asked gently. "Maybe you just don't remember it?" Now, sitting alone in my living room at 3 in the morning, surrounded by 8 years' worth of photographic evidence documenting this gradual, methodical manipulation, I could finally see the complete pattern with devastating clarity. Sarah hadn't entered our lives motivated by love or genuine connection. She'd arrived with a carefully constructed plan, a plan that was now reaching its calculated climax with this lawsuit seeking to declare me mentally incompetent. But Sarah had made one critical, potentially fatal mistake in her scheming. She had catastrophically underestimated her opponent. She'd chosen to target a woman who had spent 25 years learning to detect liars, manipulators, and con artists in her courtroom. A woman trained to see through deception and identify hidden motives. And now, for the first time in years, I felt completely, crystalline clear and awake. The fog of manipulation was lifting, and I could see everything with perfect clarity. The next morning, I arrived at my office before dawn, filled with a determination I hadn't experienced in years. If Sarah wanted to engage in a dirty fight, I was prepared to teach her exactly what an experienced judge could accomplish when she decided to truly investigate. "Linda," I said the moment my assistant arrived, "I need you to do something for me. It has to remain absolutely confidential." "Of course, Charlotte. What do you need?" "I want a comprehensive, detailed report on Sarah Mendoza. Everything you can possibly find, complete work history, credit history, public records, any legal proceedings she's been involved in, anything and everything." Linda raised one eyebrow questioningly but didn't press for details. After working closely with me for 15 years, she understood that when I requested something like this, I had solid reasons. While I waited for that information to materialize, I decided to conduct my own parallel investigation. I began by calling some of my contacts in the real estate sector, where Sarah had supposedly worked before her alleged termination. "Sarah Mendoza?" Patricia Vega, a real estate agent I'd known professionally for years, said when I called. "Oh yes, she worked at our agency for a few months. We had to fire her for cause." "May I ask why?" I pressed, my heart beginning to pound. Patricia hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Charlotte, you know I generally don't enjoy speaking negatively about anyone, but that woman was seriously problematic. She consistently lied to clients about properties, deliberately inflated prices beyond market value, and worst of all, we discovered she was systematically using confidential client information for her own personal benefit." My stomach clenched painfully. "What kind of confidential information?" "Personal financial information, bank statements, tax returns, investment portfolios." She had legitimate access to these documents as part of her job, and we discovered evidence that she'd been taking detailed notes about clients' assets and financial situations. When we confronted her about it, she claimed she was simply being thorough in her professional duties and researching clients' financial capabilities. That same afternoon, Linda returned to my office with a thick file that made my blood run cold. "Sarah Mendoza was not who any of us believed her to be." "Charlotte," Linda said, her voice trembling slightly with barely controlled emotion, "you absolutely need to see this immediately." The documents revealed a pattern so terrifying it took my breath away. Sarah Mendoza wasn't even her real legal name. Her birth name was Sarah Miller, and she'd legally changed her identity 5 years before she'd ever met David, a deliberate, calculated reinvention. More disturbing still, Sarah Miller had been married twice before David. Her first husband, a man named Robert Chen, had died in a suspicious car accident just 3 years after their marriage. During the subsequent probate process, Robert's adult children had formally alleged that Sarah had systematically manipulated their elderly, vulnerable father into changing his will at the last minute, leaving everything to her instead of his biological children. The case had never reached trial because Sarah had accepted a quiet out-of-court settlement, but the documents showed she'd received over $500,000 as a result. Her second marriage had been to a widower named James Anderson. According to the official court records, James had filed for divorce, making serious allegations of emotional abuse and deliberate financial manipulation. In his sworn legal statement, James had claimed that Sarah had methodically tried to convince him that he was losing his memory and required assistance managing his own finances. "She made me feel like I was losing my mind completely," James had written in his heartbreaking statement. "She would constantly tell me about conversations we'd supposedly had that I had absolutely no memory of, promises I'd supposedly made that I knew I'd never made. Gradually, I began doubting my own memory, my own sanity, my own grasp on reality. The chilling similarities to my current situation were impossible to ignore." But the most disturbing revelation was that James Anderson had died of a sudden, unexpected heart attack just 6 months after filing for divorce, dying before the case could be resolved in court and before any psychological evaluation could prove his mental competence. "Linda," I said, my voice barely rising above a whisper, "I need you to contact the attorney who represented James Anderson in his divorce proceedings. I also want to speak directly with Robert Chen's children if they're willing." Over the following days, I painstakingly pieced together the true, horrifying story of the woman who had been systematically infiltrating my life, manipulating my family, and now attempting to have me declared legally incompetent. I called Patricia Chen, Robert's daughter, first. Her voice broke with emotion when I explained who I was and why I was reaching out to her. "We knew she would do this again eventually," Patricia told me, her voice thick with unshed tears and barely controlled anger. "We tried desperately to warn James Anderson's family after Dad died, but they didn't believe us. They thought we were just bitter, resentful relatives angry about losing our inheritance." "Tell me about your father," I requested gently. "My father was a brilliant man, a retired aerospace engineer with a mind like a steel trap. When he met Sarah, he just lost my mother after 50 years of happy marriage. He was vulnerable, lonely, grieving. She recognized that vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly." Patricia described in painful detail how Sarah had gradually, systematically isolated Robert from his children, convincing him that they were only interested in his money and didn't genuinely care about his well-being. She'd planted insidious doubts about Robert's mental health, subtly suggesting he needed help making important decisions. In the end, Dad changed his will without telling any of us, without even mentioning it. When he passed away, we discovered that Sarah had inherited absolutely everything. "But the money wasn't even the worst part, Charlotte." Patricia's voice broke completely. "The worst part was that the last years of my father's life were utterly miserable. He genuinely believed he was going crazy, that he was becoming a burden to everyone who loved him. That's the real crime. She stole his peace of mind, his dignity, his sense of self." Patricia's words struck me like physical blows. It was exactly, precisely what Sarah was attempting to do to me. I also spoke at length with Michael Anderson, James's younger brother. His story was even more disturbing and detailed. "James wasn't just my brother, he was my best friend, my confidant," Michael told me, his voice rough with grief that hadn't healed. "When he started dating Sarah, he seemed genuinely renewed and happy at first. But he gradually changed in subtle, troubling ways. He became anxious, deeply insecure, constantly questioning his own memory. He'd ask us repeatedly if he'd said or done specific things that he couldn't remember doing." "What did you think was happening?" I asked. "Initially, we attributed it to work stress or perhaps normal aging. James was 62, after all. But when he finally confided in us about what Sarah was actually doing, the systematic gaslighting, the manipulation, everything suddenly made perfect, terrible sense." Michael explained how Sarah had been meticulously documenting every minor instance of forgetfulness, every moment of completely normal confusion. She'd kept an extraordinarily detailed diary of supposed incidents that she planned to use as evidence proving James was losing his mental faculties. "She had pages and pages and pages of notes," Michael continued, his voice bitter with remembered anger. "Date, time, specific incident description. But when James finally showed us that diary, we realized that at least half the incidents she documented had never actually happened, or had been taken completely out of context and distorted beyond recognition. What happened when he filed for divorce? I asked. Michael's voice turned even more bitter. Sarah immediately counterattacked with her own lawsuit. She filed legal proceedings alleging that James was mentally incompetent and suffering from progressive dementia. She used that meticulously fabricated diary as her primary evidence. The judge ordered a comprehensive psychological evaluation to determine the truth. James was scheduled to undergo that evaluation the week immediately after he died of that supposedly natural heart attack. That night, I sat alone in my study, carefully organizing all the information I'd collected into a coherent timeline. The pattern was crystal clear, undeniable, and absolutely terrifying. Sarah was a practiced predator who specialized in targeting vulnerable older adults with assets. Her method was always identical: gain complete trust, systematically isolate the victim from their support systems, plant persistent doubts about their mental competence, and then strike legally when the victim was at their most vulnerable and defenseless. But there was something crucial that Sarah hadn't considered in her planning. I wasn't a helpless, defenseless victim. I was a judge with 25 years of courtroom experience, with contacts throughout the entire legal system, with skills in detecting deception and manipulation. And now I knew exactly who and what she was. The next day, I began taking my own meticulous notes, documenting every interaction with Sarah, every phone call, every unexpected visit, every subtle manipulation. If she wanted to play the documentation game, I was prepared to show her how it should really be done by a professional. I also had discreet security cameras professionally installed throughout my house. If Sarah was going to continue using her key to let herself in without permission or warning, I wanted video evidence of absolutely everything she did while I was away. But my most significant discovery came when I contacted the attorney who had represented James Anderson in his divorce proceedings. He confirmed something I'd begun to suspect but hoped wasn't true. "It's quite interesting that you're calling me now," James's lawyer said when he finally agreed to speak with me off the record. "Marcus Riley, Sarah's attorney, contacted me just last week asking detailed questions about legal precedents for cases of mental incompetence in older adults. He was specifically interested in cases involving retired judges and their unique legal knowledge." The blood in my veins turned to ice. Sarah hadn't just randomly decided to attack me. She'd been specifically, carefully preparing to face someone with exactly my legal background and expertise. That night, as I sat reviewing all the documents spread across my dining room table like pieces of an elaborate puzzle, I felt an unfamiliar combination of terror and fierce determination. Sarah had made one critical, potentially fatal mistake in her planning. She had severely underestimated my ability and willingness to fight back with everything I had. But I also had to acknowledge something more frightening. Sarah hadn't chosen David because she loved him or even because she saw him as an easy source of money. She had deliberately chosen me as her primary target from the very beginning. David had simply been the means to access me, the key to unlocking my trust and my bank accounts. And now, for the first time in many years, I had to admit to myself that I was genuinely, deeply scared of what might come next. I couldn't keep this devastating secret any longer. David deserved to know the complete truth about the woman he'd been married to for 8 years, regardless of how much it would hurt him. But I also understood that presenting him with the full, ugly truth about Sarah would be like surgically removing his heart without anesthesia. I asked him to meet me at my house on a Friday evening. Sarah was supposedly attending one of her mysterious business meetings, though I now strongly suspected she was actually meeting with Marcus Riley to plan her next legal maneuver. "David, please sit down," I said when he arrived, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "We need to have a serious conversation about Sarah." "Mom, if this is about the lawsuit, I've already told you multiple times that she's just genuinely worried about your well-being and—" "Your wife's real name isn't Sarah Mendoza," I interrupted bluntly, deciding direct confrontation was the only approach that would penetrate his denial. David stared at me as if I'd completely lost my mind. What on earth are you talking about? Without a word, I handed him the thick folder containing all the documents I'd painstakingly collected. His face turned visibly pale as he leafed through the papers with trembling hands, and I watched him physically recoil when he reached the photographs of Sarah's two previous husbands. This can't possibly be real, David murmured, his voice hollow and distant. This has to be some kind of mistake or forgery. David, look at me, I said firmly, taking both his hands in mine. Your wife is a professional con artist. She specializes in targeting vulnerable older people with assets. You were never her primary target. I was. You were simply her means of access. No. David shook his head violently, denial written across every feature. This is impossible. Sarah loves me. We've been married for 8 years. 8 years. And in those 8 years, how much of my money have you two borrowed? I asked quietly. David fell silent. We both knew the answer with painful precision. More than $200,000. Money that had never been repaid and, I now understood, had never been intended to be repaid. Mom, all young marriages experience financial difficulties. That doesn't automatically mean Sarah is some kind of con artist or. He couldn't bring himself to say the word. Murderer, I finished for him, the word hanging in the air between us like poison gas. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against my floor. A murderer? Mom, now you're genuinely being delusional. This is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking Sarah's been worried about. Sit down and let me finish presenting the evidence, I commanded in the authoritative voice I'd perfected over 25 years on the bench. Reluctantly, David sank back into his chair, and I systematically laid out everything I'd discovered. I explained in detail about Robert Chen and his convenient death immediately after changing his will. I described James Anderson and his fatal heart attack occurring at the most opportune possible moment for Sarah, just before the psychological evaluation that would have definitively proven his complete mental competence. Those are just tragic coincidences, David insisted, but his voice lacked conviction, wavering with growing doubt. Really? I challenged him. And is it also merely coincidence that she used the exact same attorney, Marcus Riley, for all 3 cases? That she followed precisely the same pattern with you and me that she used with her previous victims? I showed him examples of the detailed notes Sarah had been compiling about my supposed episodes of confusion and cognitive decline. David's face went white as he recognized them immediately. I've seen these on Sarah's desk at our house, he admitted quietly. She told me she was keeping them because she was worried about you, to help you remember things better and track your symptoms. David, look directly at me, I commanded. Have you ever personally witnessed even one of these supposed episodes she's documented in such detail? David sat in thoughtful silence for a long, agonizing moment. Not directly, no. But Sarah told me about them. She described them in such detail that I believed her. Like when I supposedly forgot to turn off the bathroom faucet and flooded the entire bathroom? Yes, exactly like. That never happened, David. Or when you allegedly left your car keys in the refrigerator? Also never happened. Or when you supposedly invited the same neighbors to dinner twice in the same week because you'd forgotten about the first invitation? David, I'm beginning to think perhaps you're the one who needs a comprehensive mental evaluation if you've been believing all these fabricated lies without question. The frustration in his voice was palpable and painful to hear. So you're seriously claiming that Sarah invented all of this? Every single incident?